Let me ask you about the Chauvin trial. So you wrote a lot about it. I was following your writing during the Chauvin trial, and the media was only giving us one side of the story. It was remarkable when I'd go to NBC and they'd be talking about what the state prosecutor, the prosecutor's witness said, this, and this. And they were all really great for the prosecutor.
Right.
And then on cross, when the defense actually challenged these ideas and did great, they would say nothing. So sure enough, you mentioned earlier that a lot of people begin to expect a conviction, or at least an indictment with Darren Wilson in Ferguson.
Right.
People were shocked when this guy was not charged with anything. And it's because the media wasn't giving him the truth. However, over a long enough period of time with propaganda and manipulation and riots, this time, not only did they get their indictment, they got a conviction on all charges. So not only is the media giving a false view of things, but now it seems to be working.
Right. So, by the way, a little inside baseball, that whole Darren Wilson case with Michael Brown. The reason he didn't get indicted was the prosecutor there made the decision to show the grand jury both sides of the argument, the facts in favor of guilt, misconduct by the officer, and the facts that mitigate, that made it appear to be a justifiable use of force, and he let the grand jury make the decision. He had no obligation to do that. He could have only offered the half of the story that would have gotten the officer indicted, but he offered both sides. Grand jury looked at it, said, nope, looks like a justified use of force to us. You know what happened to that prosecutor? Next election, he had a Soros-backed candidate who defeated him as prosecutor, and that guy ran in part, the competitor ran in part on immediately reopening the Michael Brown case. So he did.
Is that happening?
Yeah, he reopened it, looked at it for 3 weeks, closed it again immediately because there's simply no evidence consistent with the officer having done anything wrong. But he won the election, so he's now in that seat. He won political power through this propagandistic narrative.
I don't know how you solve that problem, man.
Well, people need to know who their prosecutor is. I bet nobody at this table knows who the local prosecutor is here because normal people don't know.
Right.
You need to know. You need to care. These are enormously powerful positions, and they're cheap to buy. Most prosecutorial races involve a few $1,000s. So if someone's willing to come in and drop $50,000 in a he just bought that seat.
Well, so there has been a wave of progressive or leftist DAs. We just had a story, and this one's going to get us in trouble on YouTube, but the what's the guy's name? Chesa Bowden. You know this guy in San Francisco?
Yes.
He's a progressive prosecutor, and he had a domestic abuser arrested twice, and he cut him loose twice, saying, "Oh, but the wife won't file charges against him,"
right.
Even though in California, domestic violence is a charge from the state. You're victimizing the state in this case, and I do that because, of course, the victim who's being beaten by you isn't going to come and speak out. Well, after he got released twice, he went back home and he murdered a 7-year-old baby. So this is what happens when you get... I don't want to draw a direct one-to-one correlation between him being this new woke DA and releasing this guy, but it is consistent with what we've seen from these leftist prosecutors who are like, I'm going to let this guy go.
Well, you don't get less crime by letting all the bad guys you've arrested immediately out of prison. This is the same prosecutor who told his assistant DAs, don't argue 3 strikes under Florida law for any of these people that are being brought into court. Pretend 3 strikes doesn't exist. Now, reasonable people can agree or disagree about whether they think 3 strikes is good public policy or not. But here, the prosecutors under him actually went to court to fight his order. And maybe they don't agree with 3 strikes themselves, but it would be unlawful under state law for them to do. He was telling his prosecutors to act unlawfully in arguing their cases in court, and they weren't willing to accept that legal liability.
Well, who was the prosecutor in the Derek Chauvin trial?
Well, they had a whole passel of them.
I'm sorry, who was the one who basically initiated the charges?
I don't know who would have initiated it. They had at least 4
AG,
prosecutors in court themselves. Yeah. Oh, Keith Ellison, the state attorney general.
Right.
Well, what happened in that case was the local prosecutor didn't want anything to do with the case, basically, and handed it off to the state, so the state would take responsibility, which Keith Ellison was happy to do.
Yep.
And, of course, he then brought in a whole panel of prosecutors, only 2 of whom were actual state prosecutors. Of the 10 or 12 attorneys admitted to prosecute that case, only 2 were state prosecutors. All the others were private attorneys from very high-end law firms who volunteered to work for free to prosecute Derek Chauvin.
How is that legal? How is that allowed?
He's permitted to bring in anybody he wants that the court will accept as an attorney for that case, and the court's generally willing to accept. And these, by the way, are all excellent attorneys. They're all very, very good attorneys. But it was a gross mismatch between these 10 or 12 prosecutors. working on the state side, and one, frankly, run-of-the-mill defense attorney, perfectly nice guy, perfectly capable attorney, but nothing special, working for the defense.
Is there anything in modern history that would reflect, like, is similar to what we saw with Chauvin, meaning the state brings in prestigious prosecutors, the city settles with the Floyd family during the trial? Have you ever seen anything like that?
No, I've not. And it's extremely unusual to, especially during jury selection. There's no point then to rush to a settlement. You may as well wait and see if criminal liability has been found. Do a settlement after the fact. If they'd settled very quickly after the event, I wouldn't have been surprised. But to wait as long as they did to jury selection and then suddenly rush to settlement, knowing the biasing effect, and maybe that's why it was done, knowing the biasing effect that it would have. And I've never seen a case in which the large majority of the quote-unquote prosecutors on the case were actually private attorneys who were brought in as a kind of hit team.
That seems crazy to me. But what seems crazy to me after that is who in their right mind would stay in Minnesota? I mean, the state. I mean, Keith Ellison's the AG, right? So this is statewide. That means if you're a cop anywhere in Minnesota,
right,
and you do anything to save someone else or protect yourself, you're going to prison.
And this is increasingly common. This is a pattern now where people might think, hey, I don't live in the city. It's safe where I live. I live out in the country. It's a nice, safe community. I know who my prosecutor is. I see him at the grocery store every once in a while. He's a nice guy. I'm sure he wouldn't prosecute me. But what often happens is the local prosecutor gets removed from the decision-making process, and it gets handed off to a chosen prosecutor from a different district. That happened in the George Zimmerman trial. The local prosecutor, to him, it was so clearly self-defense. He quit his job rather than bring charges against George Zimmerman.
Wow.
And they just brought in Deborah Nelson from a different part of Florida to be the prosecutor in that case. Or you see the case handed off to a state-level prosecutor, like with Keith Ellison in the Chauvin trial, or with the Ahmaud Arbery case in Georgia. You have a prosecutor, local prosecutor looks at it. I don't want to bring charges here. Second prosecutor, I don't want to bring charges. Third prosecutor, I don't want anything to do with it, and they hand it off to a prosecutor from another part of the state.
Why are they handing it off?
Because it's a political hot potato. Everybody knows what Benjamin Crump is going to turn the case into. They don't want any part of it.
Maybe they should grow some spines.
Or maybe they feel the political pressure they're going to face is simply going to be overwhelming for someone who spent $1,500 to become a local prosecutor.
$1,500. It's amazing. It's kind of scary that it's that cheap to buy one of these positions.
Yeah,
you make a good point with the Michael Brown thing, where the prosecutor got ousted and they lost his job.
Yep.
So it seems like even if they do grow spine and say get away from me, they'll just lose their job and they'll bring in somebody else.
That's what happens.
Man, the propaganda is taking over, and I gotta say, it's making me pretty pessimistic. I try to be optimistic a little bit sometimes. I am fairly pessimistic, which is a problem. But we've had some James Carville comes out and says wokeness is a problem. There are some signs that maybe we're starting to see people realize the problem of these narratives. But then I hear this stuff, and it's been ongoing for like a decade. And the Chauvin trial was the worst of the worst, where, I mean, when I think it was the LAPD use of force expert, I think it was. Was it him who said?
Sergeant Steiger for the state.
Was he the guy who said that Chauvin was entitled to use a taser and chose not to?
Yeah, he absolutely was, because of course a taser is non-deadly force.
Well, so how do you convince a jury that Chauvin was intending to assault or injure Floyd when he de-escalated, he used a lesser force option, and even called EMS?
Because that wasn't really the question that the jury was being asked to answer. The question was not, how do we decide this case on the legal merits? The question was, do we want to convict this guy and all go home and live a quiet life, or do we want to acquit on any one of these charges and be burned alive in our homes? The
woman, one of the jurors, she didn't know she was an alternate, and I'm sure you saw this, said, I didn't want to go through the riots and the destruction again, and I was worried someone would come to my house and retaliate.
Right, and you can hardly blame her, because the threat of violence is real. There's a reason they had National Guardsmen outside the courthouse. There was barbed wire. The jurors were escorted to the courtroom by state police with machine guns. This is not because the threat of violence is fantasy.
Wait, they had machine guns? Like, you mean it?
Well,
you know your guns.
Yeah.
So.
The state police would be armed with MP5s or something equivalent.
So the actual select fire rifles.
Yeah, sure. They're not. Law enforcement doesn't buy semi-automatic guns.
Right.
There's
Exactly.
no restriction on them having full auto. So
great, they're allowed to have weapons of war, I suppose. That's sure. And
the jurors, of course, they're going to and from the courthouse every day during this trial, past the National Guardsmen, the barbed wire. They know that stuff exists for a reason. They were told by the judge, look, we'll try to keep your identity secret while you're in court, which is nonsense because all these people disappeared from their normal jobs for 3 weeks at a time, right? So everyone in their circle, social circle, knows that they're not gone. They're not there for a reason. And they know eventually, the judge told them, we will release your names to the public.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be a good outcome from it. I mean, the defense use of force expert had blood and a pig's head left at his former home. That wasn't intended to intimidate him or change his testimony. His testimony was over.
Right, it was for the jurors.
It was for the benefit. And by the way, this applies also to every prospective juror, witness, expert, for any of these future trials coming up, the Rittenhouse trial coming up, the McCloskey trial coming up, the Ahmaud Arbery trial coming up, all those people also, everyone going through jury selection there knows what to anticipate now.
Let me pull up a story real quick because there's something that you're getting me. Here we go. It's BBC. Ladies and gentlemen, we have this story from the BBC. Anger as ex-generals warn of deadly civil war in France. Now, the reasons they're giving for why they think France will descend into civil war is a bit different. They're talking about, what they call no-go zones in French neighborhoods. But in an open letter to the president, they mentioned that this leftist dogma is going to result in their country descending into civil war. Now, we're not France. I understand that. But seeing this story and then hearing what you just said, we're talking about the Chauvin Trial, the pig's head and blood left at someone's home, the riots and the threats from Maxine Waters. We have federal politicians saying, unless we get mob justice, we will riot more.
Right.
How can there be confidence in this government, in our country? Similar to what it's not one for one with what the French generals were saying. But with this leftist dogma, it seems like their moral framework is there is no truth but power and might makes right. That's what they believe. Why would any individual in this country who believes in the American moral framework, innocent until proven guilty, just sit by and let this happen? Now, I understand for the time being, they are. After everything we saw in Minnesota, there are still people who would believe or ignore, what's happening. They would believe the lies or ignore what's happening in this state. But for those of us that are paying attention, it's getting terrifying because there's an argument, in my opinion, based on everything I've read, maybe manslaughter. I don't know. What's your opinion on the Chauvin? Maybe manslaughter?
Well, I think there was reasonable doubt on every one of those criminal charges. Yeah, that doesn't mean he didn't do something wrong. It doesn't even mean, it could be probably true that he committed a crime. But that's not the legal standard.
Right,
the legal standard is it has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And I did not see that here.
I agree. I guess what I'm trying to say is if someone told me that based on everything that was presented to the jurors found, maybe manslaughter, I'd be like, that makes sense, I guess. I wouldn't, I might not agree with that. But it's guilty on all counts, second-degree murder. We all watched
hours of deliberations.
Within hours.
This is a case in which there were over 55,000 exhibits of evidence in which there was sufficient video that individual expert witnesses said they spent 100 to 150 hours reviewing the video evidence. And the jurors went into deliberations and less than 10 hours later came back with a verdict. That wasn't due deliberation and argument over the evidence in that case and whether it met the legal standard. That was people who were terrorized. And I think the public looks at this. Look, first of all, you'd have to accept that a jury that effectively has a gun to its head is anything like any model of justice any of us would want for ourselves or a loved one, because that's effectively what happened in this case. But first, people would have to recognize that that's what happened. And second of all, even if they did recognize that this was a gross injustice, and by the way, it's a gross injustice regardless of the verdict. So Chauvin could have been convicted in a fair process. And justice in America is not supposed to be about the outcome. It's supposed to be about a just process. If we trust the process, we accept the outcome regardless of what it might be. But if the process is inherently corrupt, you don't get anything like justice out the other end. So first you have to recognize the process is corrupt. But even if you do recognize that, well, what's an individual person supposed to do about it? Except hope that when they're swimming in the water, the shark doesn't happen to come for them.
Thanks for checking out this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. If you want to see the full show, come back to this channel, youtube.com/TimcastIRL, Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., where you can leave comments and super chat, and we actually will read your comments on the show. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe. And if you want exclusive members-only content, segments you can't get anywhere else, go to timcast.com, become a member, and we even have full bonus episodes. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.